Hello guys, welcome back to another class. Today is a little special. Thank you guys for 1,000 subscribers. We finally did it. It's a celebration to be had. I'm kind of, having my own cake at home. I really do enjoy everybody's company, and I really do like that everybody is enjoying the channel so far. As for everything else, let's get started onto today's class. Today's class is going to be about attack strategies that you need to know, what you really need to pay attention to when you're struggling to create a strategy, and anything in between. We're first going to be covering the fundamentals, and this might mean things like everything that you might have to pay attention to in the background. And other things might involve, the decision trees that you need to go through in order to choose the right strategy. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get started. For anyone that just joined, I do recommend that you kind of mute your mic, and I would appreciate it. Okay, so let's get going. Again, fundamentals on attack. We're not going to be teaching you how to clear on attack. A clearing guide is coming soon in the form of a different video, but in case you were kind of wondering as to what kind of decision you should be making for which strategy works best for you, this is the right class for you. We're going to be talking about the 5 strategies afterwards and just some things to keep in mind. First things first, fundamentals. If you're going to have an easy time, if you're going to have a hard time clearing most of the angles that we're going to be talking about, right, it's going to come from the fact that you don't really know the common angles in your elo. Each elo has a lot of different angles that players might take. Some of them are a little bit easier to spot than others. So for example, on Icebox, you might see this little headshot angle right here. Very common angle for a lot of people to take, but there's others that might vary depending on which map that you are in, right? When you're looking at these two maps, this is A site on Icebox, and this is A site on Ascent. You can see the difference between these two positions, and both of these maps have different locations that an enemy might take. For example, somebody might hold by the barrels on the right. Somebody might push up over here by A main, right? These things are common when it comes to how an enemy might play. And in order for you to have a strong attack, you need to have a decent understanding of these common locations. If you're dying from these angles and you're not paying attention to where you're dying from, or you're dying and you're not keeping an eye as to where that you got killed from, it's going to cause problems. Okay, depending on the map, these angles might become a lot more complex. They might become a lot more in numbers, or you might have to pay attention to how you're going to be clearing them with your team. Some of them might be a lot easier. For example, Ascent. You're going to notice that a lot of them are a lot easier to kind of grasp. They're all behind cover, right? But at the same time, this doesn't mean that the map is going to be relatively easier, right? There's some things that you have to keep in mind. So if you're going to be considering having a stronger attack, then I would suggest keeping an eye as to where these angles are going to be coming from. These are just 2 examples. There's plenty of different locations that your enemy might come in from, depending on your elo. Someone might not even swing over here. Okay, instead, they might just stand out here in the open. Pay attention to those angles, and it's going to improve your attack. The second thing that you need to keep an eye out on is pretty much your utility. I've seen this all of the time, and I've been playing a lot of Reyna in ranked recently, like a lot of Reyna, and whenever I see an enemy Reyna, I've noticed the same thing happen too many times. Smokes are down, everybody's pushing in, Reyna flashes, Reyna flash gets shot, Reyna dies. What just happened? Normally what happens when you are looking into utility that's destructible, a lot of times you see opponents or even players in your own team use it by themselves. You're pushing out C long on Haven, and then your Sova is going to throw out a dart to figure out what's going on backside. The thing gets shot down. You have no information. Now what? Right? In order for you to get better into attack, you need to learn to combine these pieces of utility. Timing this utility means that you're going to be able to overwhelm the opponent that's on site, and you might get more output out of that utility. So a good example over here is combining something as simple as satchels, some sort of entry utility, with something else that needs to be shot will divert the attention from either dealing with the raise or dealing with the dart. There's no in between. They have to deal with one or the other. And making that decision is what's going to make it a lot easier for your team to capitalize on the space that you're going to be taking. Now, it is normal for people to sort of like smoke early in case your smokes last a long time. Like on Bind, you see Brim, you might see Brim be used and the smokes come down early, right? That's fine. And there's some other do's and don'ts that we might have to pay attention to. So for example, some of the do's and don'ts that kind of work out is, for example, using drone early. These are very powerful things that you might use at the beginning, pieces of utility that you can use to catch people on off angles. So for example, somebody might be on top of this yellow area by icebox. You can catch them with a drone. You can do things like catching people that are pushing up with a drone. This is an okay that you can do. Sorry, it's an okay do because you can kind of pay attention to what the enemy is doing. You can catch them off guard. You can kind of like pick them off early. This is an okay do because you are using the utility with a different purpose than that of entry. You're trying to catch opponents as opposed to just using it for info on the entry. Other things that you can kind of pay attention to on the do side is kind of combining two different pieces of utility at once. Now, we talked about the dart entry combo. This can also be combined with other things, such as a flash entry, such as a smoke entry, right? There's a lot of things you can do when you're combining these two things at once, but I would recommend that you sort of pay attention to the shootable utility more than just that of entry, because there's more than one piece of utility that's going to get used at once. And the more popular one is a dart flash combo. If you're not using any sort of information utility, I would say that's already a huge problem with the comp that you are playing in. But regardless, if you are not, try to combine different flashes. For example, you can combine something like a sky flash that might not be able to be shot with something like maybe like a jet smoke or something like that, right? Try to combine pieces of utility that you can always use and try to use them as close as possible. Because if you see someone like a Sova just throw the dart out, sure, we know there's somebody back site, but we could have inferred that already from the fact that there's going to be somebody on site. Don't waste utility. Now, with that out of the way, that kind of covers the don'ts. Don't use flash or dart too early or too late. The team's already inside. What's the point of the flash? You're going to flash your team. You're using the dart too early. You already knew there was somebody on site. What's that going to do, right? We already talked about that destructible utility, right? Using it with no purpose or early. I mean, you're already going to figure out that someone's going to be backside. Don't get that stuff destroyed just because you think that's going to provide some sort of value. Make sure you always think ahead, right? Other pieces of utility, for example, like the drone over here, you can use it with the purpose of catching people off guard. Maybe you suspect there's an op. These are okay things to do. But if you're just doing it with the intention of just throwing it out there and your team is way behind you and you're just kind of droning ahead of time and no one's capitalizing on that space, then it might be a 50-50 on whether that drone was good or not. Okay. Lastly, wasting time after smokes are down. I think this one's pretty straightforward, but it needs to be mentioned. If your team is throwing smokes down and your people aren't pushing in, there's a problem there. However, we're going to be talking about some things you can do to troubleshoot when that happens. Let's talk about the strats. Actually, no, I need to talk about the last little bit here. So when it comes to entry, when it comes to the different pieces of utility that you use, right, you have to find ways to kind of like time all that utility and so forth. But it also comes down to who goes in first. Now, everybody already agrees that the duelists are the first people to go in, right? And then you might think initiators and then smokes and then sentinels, usually because of the amount of utility that they provide for the team. However, some things might change, and it is your job to identify what those changes are, okay? Normally, like I said, duelists go in for the intention of they have to go in, they have good, strong entry potential, and, they die, right? What we're talking about right now is the idea of numbering your teammates and who goes in first, who goes in next, because this allows your team to sort of identify who does what. Number one is usually with the intention of just going in, trying to clear as many angles as possible, trying to clear as many close angles as possible, potentially getting traded off. Number two has the responsibility of clearing what this guy isn't going to be clearing and trading off when they die. The third one, same thing. Fourth one, same thing. Normally with the intention of, again, trying to clear as many angles as possible while keeping the relatively less stronger, less utility intensive agents alive and the ones that are weaker, dead. So this might mean that you might have a duelist, then an initiator, then a controller, then a sentinel, depending on how your team is in terms of structure. However, some things might change that dynamic. For example, we've talked about Clove in the past, and Clove, their ult allows them to stay alive because even if they die, they can get rest back up, right? You can use Clove alongside maybe something like a Reyna flash, and then Reyna can then trade them off simply because they're going to be coming back and you don't really need to lose that player early. You can use Clove as an entry as opposed to using your utility. Using your duelist and, wasting a lot of utility. You can do other things. So for example, maybe for example, you were using Brim and you used a bunch of your smokes. You are now out of utility. you provide no value to your team other than staying alive. If you have no utility, nothing's going to be coming back. If you have no ults, nothing is going to be used. So instead, you could use that extra life that you're going to be using and instead entry for your team. This might happen. This has happened in games. So don't be afraid to kind of change the numbering and entry sequence. If someone still has utility, they might still provide a lot more value. So keep that in the back of your mind. And this is numbering. So ults that might keep you kind of like guessing might be something like K or Clove that might be really easy to kind of identify. But other ones, again, like that utility, that might be an easy one to sort of like keep an eye on. With that out of the way, now let's talk about the strategies. The first one we're going to be talking about is rushing. Rushing is a really strong attack strategy used to overwhelm the opponents. Normally, this is a strategy that you should be using when you have a strong read on the opponent. You shouldn't just rush a site just because. There's usually some things that you have to keep an eye on before you rush. Okay? When you are rushing, right, it is very, very important for you to sort of identify 3 different things. Maybe 4 if we're kind of, classifying them differently. The first one is, do you have a read? Let's say, for example, you look at the scoreboard and you notice that their Cypher, despite the fact that it's a Cypher, is playing alone, or they're very weak, or they're at the very bottom of the leaderboard, therefore they're not very strong mechanically. There's a lot of things you can do to kind of identify that read, right? Then just simply through that read, you can just hit site without any stops, without any breaks. You just go through. Again, keep that eye on that numbering and you should be okay. However, there's some things that might stop you. If you don't really have a man advantage, you didn't get a pick. Maybe as you were pushing, you lost somebody. Maybe as you were going in, you don't have an ult. You don't have an economy advantage. Maybe, they don't have any like pistols or anything. It's just a simple, rifle versus rifle round. You can start paying attention to the symptoms of a bad push. So what could stop you? The biggest one is simply stall. The biggest example is a stall. A molly smoke combo is the most common thing that might occur in a push that will stop your team. And I've seen this way too many times. Molly's on the floor, duelists are in, rest of the team is held back. Now what? You already lost your smokes, you lost your entry potential, and you lost your duelist. How can you stop that? Being able to read that type of stuff while the round is happening is crucial in a good rush. So what can you do? Let's say, for example, you're expecting that smoke to come down. You can use this sort of rush strategy to pull out a lot of these pieces of utility, which can allow you to wait it out. Once you wait it out, you can then instead use it to sort of either rotate out or you can contest it. You can contest that smoke once that molly is out with maybe information from a drone, maybe like a skydog, or you can use more offensive utility like flashes and grenades. You can use all of these together to sort of deal with that push regardless of the stall. Just be mindful of it. Another thing you can do is sort of work into a more restructure-like concept where you can look at things like a default. We realize that it's not working out. We can rotate out. Maybe we can re-hit if we need to, but we can instead look at things like, what are the flanks? What are they doing? How many people rotated off? How many people are they on the site? For example, we notice that Cypher is on A, but he is now on B. What's happening, right? You can look at all of these things and kind of count for those rotations. It's very convoluted at first, but over time you kind of get a feel for it, right? You start realizing that this guy wasn't here, but now he is here, so we can kind of use that to kind of leave, right? Another form of restructuring is not just looking at stalls, but their setups. Now, we talked about that weak Cypher. What if they're not weak? What if they are very strong and they're completely destroying your team? Looking at that might leave you for different things. So for example, we're going to be talking about splits in just a moment. We talked about defaults in just a little bit, but we're going to be looking at what you can do with a split to sort of demolish a strong setup. Last but not least, if that stall is coming in, you can use the space that you gain through this really overwhelming push on mains to leave a lurk. This is a really strong way to maintain control of the map, despite the fact that you failed to push. Okay? Let's go on to the next one. Now, we talked about what happens if they have a strong setup. This is where splits are good. Splits are really good for diverting attention away from the main choke. It essentially causes whoever is playing by the setup to no longer focus on that A main, B main sort of choke and forces them to sort of spread out and divide their numbers. If you have a really good split, you're going to have an easier time controlling the map. And there's a lot of different ways to do so. Now, you can look at two different ways as to how you're going to be making that push. For the first one, you're going to be looking at a setup. So for example, if the enemy team has a really strong setup, then you have two ways to kind of make it work. You can instead kind of like play slow, kind of scaling to a good position, and then get ready to explode out. This is the more common example of how you might split. Or you can go fast. Normally, when you do fast pushes, you only do them on reads when you guys are on equal money. So for example, we just talked about how we know that they're spread out. Maybe we know where the cipher is. Maybe we know where the cipher trip is, right? We can use a Sova dart to kind of kill it. We can use a lot of different things to make a fast push. Regardless, the pacing really depends on that information. If you don't have an economy advantage, if you don't have a man advantage, if you don't have an ult advantage, if you don't have a read, play slow. It's going to give you a lot more time to decide as to what you're going to do in that push. But that's the setup. What about heavy rotations? Heavy rotations are a lot easier to sort of kind of identify in splits. And the best one is to just look at that stall. If you're looking at doing a split to defeat a good setup and they just are rotating really quickly, the smokes are down, everybody else is coming in. Again, you have very similar decisions to that of a rush. You can rotate out, you can contest it, right? Same things, you can leave a lurk, you can default. Or if the enemy is still weak regardless, and you still have those reads that we talked about, you can still go back and destroy that setup simply by using the same methods as before. Just keep an eye as to what you could do in case that hasn't worked in the past. You gotta make sure you have a plan B. Okay, so pretty much whenever you're looking at splits, I recommend that you look into 3-2s. So that means 3 players going down the main lane and 2 players go down the other lane, right? Whatever lane you're going to be splitting from, usually mid. Make sure that your weaker pairing, the 2s, have a duelist or some sort of good entry potential like a flash. So that out of the way, let's move on to the third potential strategy. When we're looking at contact plays, I'm seeing a lot of people not be aware of what a contact play is. What is playing contact? Contact is simply the second they see you, the play activates. So this means that an enemy might not know what you're doing and you're playing very slow. And usually what this means is you're essentially trying to get as much space as you can before they notice that you are there. That is the most common elementary way of breaking down a contact play. They can get way more convoluted than that, right? Usually when you have a good read onto a site, you can, instead of just rushing down into a particular lane, you can instead save that utility that you would to control a particular lane and instead use it to sort of dominate the main lane first and then explode after. And I'm going to be using this area right here to sort of explain. Normally, when you're going to be playing for scaling, what happens if no one is checking for that space? What happens if no one is paying attention to what you're doing? When you're looking at contact plays, you can take a lot of this space early without having to waste utility. So common example A is, we can see that in this situation, in order to take this space, we had to use Sova drone. But what if we play contact and there was no one there? Not only did we avoid using a Sova drone so that we could use it later, maybe for a post plant, but instead we can get into this position where we're ready to push out. And by the time that they notice us, maybe they jump peek, maybe they swing. By the time that they push in, notice how much space we gained. Contact plays are really useful at gaining space very, very slowly, but at the same time, you're using it to save utility. For example, you wouldn't have to flash up here. Maybe you can save the flash for up there instead. You can save a lot of more of the aggressive utility to still maintain a lead. So that's what good contact plays are about. Now, there's 2 ways to go about it, and that depends on the enemy's response. Normally, more often than not, if the enemy doesn't know what you're doing, it's very obvious that they're just going to let it happen. So a very passive example is just nothing is happening. They're not challenging you. They're just letting you scale. And by the time that you get that space, you're good to go. This is a good example of a contact play. That's it. What happens if they're more aggressive? What happens if they're not here, let's push out. Oh, they're not here, I'm going to flank. They're not here, I'm going to take this orb. If this is what's happening, you need to start analyzing and seeing what happened prior. Have they made this plays before? If they've made a play like that before, just wait it out. Usually you can kind of pay attention and see what's going on. You can usually get a kill. If they have op money, kind of pay attention to see maybe if they're waiting for you, right? There might be like a really aggressive angle that they're waiting for you to kind of walk in on. So pay attention to that. You can usually wait it out. If they're doing an aggressive play, maybe they're throwing like an omen flash and they're dashing in, you can wait it out and then kind of like start making that contact play happen. Another way to do it is, what if they're flanking? You can just lure it. You can have a firing line, and then the second you guys kill that flank, you guys can all push in, or you can kind of just lure it. Maybe, for example, throw like a Sova dart, and this might lead for everybody to kind of leave, right? You can throw a Sova dart, everybody's going to be like, okay, they're here, make that push happen. You know, they throw their smokes, they throw their omen blind, whatever. You can rotate with that. And last but not least, if they're making aggressive pushes, you can just leave a lurk. You can notice that leaving a lurk is a very common play that you can do on attack, and that is for a reason. You're keeping the space that you started with, so there's no negatives to whatever you just did. Okay, let's talk about the next play. And that's fakes. I find that people tend to mess up fakes really, really quickly because they think that it's just a matter of we haven't done a fake yet, so let's just do it now. There's a lot more when it comes to the background of when that tends to be like the best case scenario where you use a fake. The best way to trick an opponent is to pay attention to your previous plays rather than how the enemy might respond to them. Okay, so in order for you to kind of get an idea as to what that means, we're going to bring back a concept called conditioning. And conditioning is essentially doing the same thing over and over and over again, so the enemy learns about what you're doing, and therefore they're going to have some sort of reply to what you're doing. So let's say, for example, we always push A. We're always pushing A. The enemy at one point in time, the second they see a flash, they're hitting A again, guys. They're going to start rotating over, and that's what happens when they've been conditioned, okay? If they've been conditioned in the past, you can just do a fake. You can do a fake regardless of what exactly has happened in terms of how they replied, as long as they replied. They could have done a Sova dart to reply. They could have done a smoke to reply. They could have sent someone out to reply. Doesn't matter which decision they've made. As long as they've taken the bait, you can call it a fake. Okay? So in this position, make sure that you're looking at that idea of conditioning. If you haven't done something like that in the past, and then it's going to be a lot harder to sell, right? But if that hasn't happened before, then you can start preparing it. If you've noticed that it's already like near the end of the half and you haven't done a fake before, it might be fine to do so. But if you're doing it really early into the half, maybe it's like round 4, you can prepare it. Things like that is you can change expectations. Maybe you can do something fast, then something slow, then something fast again, right? Change it up a little bit. You're going to change their expectations, not allowing them to be able to learn as to what you're going to do, allowing a fake to be more effective. And the second one is preparing a lot of those things that we talked about in the past. So for example, maybe you contact play A, and that's something that they start learning, right? Maybe you're learning about stall. Maybe they're kind of like seeing a piece of utility like a Sova dart, and that's what they're learning to react to, okay? This one might be one of the hardest ones to grasp, but it's also one of the easiest ones to execute, as long as you get the timing down as to when you should be using a fake and when not, okay? And just as a rule of thumb, if you've done the same play 3 times, they're bound to expect it, okay? Don't worry about like the little minutia of like, oh no, they wouldn't expect it a 4th time or something like that, right? Just go for it. Trust me, ranked is a lot different than that of pro play. You're okay to create plays like that. With that out of the way, I've been saying the word default a lot. Defaulting has changed in meaning for what a lot of people might kind of understand from when we first started in Valorant. Before, when someone mentioned, let's do a default, it just meant, let's just play for picks. Let's just make sure that the entire team is spread out across the map with the intention of maybe looking for an opponent, maybe looking for information, maybe looking for some sort of utility that you can extract from them. Maybe you make a little bit of noise here and they put down a smoke. That's already like a plus. And that's what people tend to believe a good default is. And that's half true. There's an extra component to that of a default. Defaults are not just stay in one position and then kind of that's it, right? Kind of look for picks. Oh, we got to pick C, let's go C. We got to pick A, let's go A, right? Like it's not just a matter of that. Oh, we got to pick C, they're going to rotate C, let's go A, right? That's what everyone believes the common idea behind the default is. There's something more to it in terms of that tool set, and that is transitioning between plays. Now, what I just did right there, where I mentioned, oh, we got to pick C, let's go C, that's just a simple transition from having full control of the map to a full rush on C. Maybe it's a full transition from default to a split towards C, right? Whenever you're doing a default, don't just say default. Always have a secondary goal in mind. If you're saying default, make sure you're also aware of the reasoning behind the default. Are you losing on your rushes? Are they pushing out? Do you need more information? Do you need to draw out utility? These are all really important topics that you have to discuss with your team in the pre-buy phase, or in the buy phase rather, whenever you're picking this play. Always have a secondary transition whenever you're going to make a default happen. Let's default, see what happens, and A, and B, take garage, right? Something. It is really easy to mess up a default if you don't really know what you're going to be doing with it, because I find that a lot of players say default and they play slow. And this is where the majority of low elos, and I'll specify low elos, tend to struggle the most on. Defaults are the strongest tool in your playbook when it comes to how you play on attack. And most players are doing it wrong because they think that they need to wait for their duelist to do something. They're waiting for somebody to make a play happen. They're waiting for this ISO to pop shield and get the kill on the op. Something. Don't just waste it by playing too slow. You can instead, nothing is happening, finish with the play that we initiated. We talked about A, we talked about C, right? Make that play happen. You do not have to waste 45 seconds of the round finding something that might not come to you in the first place. Okay. If we talked, like we talked about it before, if they're not really, giving you any sort of like information, if they're not pushing out, then there's no point at a default. Try to get a read for a site, and then maybe over time they'll start replying to you by getting more space. So for example, let's say you're always taking garage and you're always taking C. Well, maybe the enemy might respond in taking B and pushing out into window, pushing out into this hay bale area by grass, right? They can do those things, but once that starts happening, don't rely on defaults as your only source of information. Try to make some plays happen. Don't be afraid to make the wrong mistake, because again, once you make a mistake, you can learn from it. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's talk about some things that you can keep in mind. First few things, you can always change your mind. And this is why that default thing is a problem, because people don't think that they can cancel. If your team is ready to push out, and this is Abyss, let's say your team is ready to push out, your duelist dies, maybe stall utilities happening, maybe they have a really strong setup, maybe they have the really strong Cypher setup that everybody talks about on A side, right? If that happens, it is okay to cancel. Don't be afraid to cancel the play regardless of how much utility you've dumped and regardless of how many people you've lost. Staying in this position will cause more problems than that of just pushing in that you think that might solve, okay? So don't just try to go in. That's not going to solve anything. Don't be afraid to cancel a play. It's actually a lot more brave to cancel a play after wasting all of your flashes and all of your smokes than it is to continue the play, because you're going to lose a lot more. People think that just because the play is done and the round is over, because they can't really get the round, that there's nothing else to really do. You can default, you can rotate over to mid, you can look for picks. Once you look for picks, you can ruin their eco a little bit. Maybe you can get a late plant. There's a lot of things that you can do that can still maintain your play active, and there's no reason for you to not cancel. That doesn't mean always cancel, right? Even if there's a smoke down, we talked about different things you can do to contest. But if it's truly a dead play and you have no other plays on the book, then yes, don't be afraid to cancel. Another one is simply applying pressure. If the opponent, let's say for example, this is actually an enemy jet. Let's say your team is pushing out and the jet is out of position. Maybe they're looking for a first blood. Maybe they are trying to do something with an op and they miss and they die. When that happens, I see that a lot of people don't apply pressure. They just stand still and they're like, what do we do? Right? And they waste precious seconds that they might use instead to push into a site. If they give you a free site because of the pressure that you pushed into, don't panic because 4 players are going to be hitting site. They have to retake, right? Abuse the space that you've gained because of somebody's poor positioning or sloppy plays that they've done initially to gain more control of a site, okay? Don't be afraid to put that pressure in. Even if you lost somebody in the trade, right? Don't be afraid to still put that pressure on, okay? So with that out of the way, we're going to cancel. Well, it's not cancel. We're going to be closing the class. Thank you guys for watching. There's a lot to basically digest here, but as you can see, I've already made it very easy. You can just kind of come back and kind of look into this. This is not the 100% all the plays that you're going to see. There's a lot of different plays that might occur, but this is a good place for you to start in case you're wondering as to where to go in your attack, okay? If you have any more questions into this, don't be afraid to drop a comment asking questions or come into the Discord and ask me. You can ping me. Done. Hey, Nano, what about this? Right? So that out of the way, let's call the class. We're going to be starting our question period.